Clicker, right?
This is the clicker. Let me just double check something.
Was it turned on?
This is on.
Yeah, I'm gonna turn it on.
Well, can you hear me? Very good.
Yeah, in PowerPoint, yeah. Yeah. There you go.
Okay, thank you. My name is Lloyd Robertson, and I'm a psychologist. My work, my area of interest is in the study of the self. And if you want to read about it, I have copies of my book on the back table there, called the Evolution of the Self. Now, this actually does relate to the topic in an oblique way, but I want to talk to you not about my professional experience. By the way, I have not been an academic most of my life. I want to share that with you. Most of my life, I've been a practitioner, and I began my life, my career, that is, not as a person who was particularly concerned with evidence-based treatments and research. I was a social worker, and then in the mid-1980s, 1985, I became a counseling and educational psychologist. And in 1993, I accepted a position as director of mental health for Northern Saskatchewan. And that's what I want to talk about, is my practical experience in Northern Saskatchewan. Now, that sounds like a career move, director of mental health. I supervised 9 social workers, mental health social workers, psych nurses, and 1 other psychologist. And in addition, I had a half-time caseload myself, because Northern Saskatchewan has a population of 34,000 squeezed into an area about the size of the 2 Koreas. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture here, if this clicker works. There we are. That is an aerial view of one of the communities in Northern Saskatchewan. That one actually has a road built into it now. There are still communities in Northern Saskatchewan that are strictly fly-in communities. And I want to talk about a couple I saw from one of those communities in the early 1990s for marital counseling. Both the wife and husband in this couple were alcoholics. When drinking, she often became violent. He was frequently bruised when I saw them. Once she stabbed him with a knife. Secretly, he kept part of his paycheck from her. And when he could afford to buy a plane ticket out of there, he walked away from the house with 1 bag and walked towards the landing strip in the community. She figured out what was going on. She hopped in their truck, ran him down, knocked him into the snow bleeding, took his money, and drove off. The police came by. And they laughed at him. And when he told me this story, he said, I laughed at myself. Why? Because just like the speaker that was just speaking, and previous speakers, she did not view him to be a man. The police did not view him to be a man. He did not view himself to be a man. That's one kind of stigma that has been talked about already in this conference. But I want to talk to you about a different kind of stigma in a while, in a few moments. But first, I want to say that this case, as an exemplar, was not unusual. I found in northern Saskatchewan many cases like that. And so I discussed this with my staff. We had been educated in social work and then again in psychology to believe that that men were overwhelmingly the perpetrators of domestic violence. In northern Saskatchewan, we found a different story, and this was correlated by the discussions I have with my 9 other staff. And so how do we make sense of this? You see, our view that we had been trained in was reinforced at that time by the Canadian authorities. In 1991, a Canadian Federal Task Force report called The War Against Women led to a national program, and we were part of that because we were briefed on how to help to do more to protect women from this onslaught of violence that was directed towards them. Some of my staff attempted to justify the female violence that we saw. They said the men must have deserved it, or that the women were just defending themselves from male aggression. These explanations, as I pointed out at the time, sounded just like the ones given by men who really were violent. So, get this, we developed a working hypothesis in northern Saskatchewan. For those who are not aware of Canadian geography, northern Saskatchewan is a hinterland boreal forest area populated mainly by lakes and trees, and has an 80% indigenous population. We came up with a brilliant hypothesis that, well, what happened is there's a subculture here that's different from the Canadian norm. We have a subculture here where women are naturally more violent than they are generically. If I can use that word, that's a poor word, but anyway. So we developed this, and what we proved was that intelligent people can find intelligent ways of confirming their bias that's already present. But in our defense, the published literature supported this view at the time. Remember, this is the early 1990s. In 1989, Kennedy and Dutton reported that 13.3% of Alberta men had initiated acts of violence against their spouses in 1 year alone. Their study was extensively cited in the War Against Women. It was not until 1999 that Simon Fraser University researcher Marilyn Kwong reviewed the data and co-authored a paper with Donald Dutton and Kim Bartholomew, correcting this imbalance of reporting from their data. Okay, I'm having a problem. Oh, back one, there we are. Okay, Kwong et al. Took the data that was collected in 1989 on Alberta men and women, and cross-tabulated the male reports of perpetration, male reports of the receipt of violence, female reports, female perpetration, female receipt. So cross-tabulated all those variables, which apparently had not been done initially. I won't go into all the data that they found because many of you are already familiar with it. But I'll point out one piece of data that stuck with me for a long time, and that is that according to female reports, their own reports, 67% of the women in the year in question reported that they had initiated the most serious incident of violence during that year, and they themselves reported that the men had initiated the violence only 26% of the time. Overall, across many tabulations, the women were more violent than the men. For example, women were almost twice as likely as men to commit more extreme acts of violence, such as choking, kicking, or using a weapon. These results paralleled what we in the field in northern Saskatchewan had seen 10 years earlier. In a newspaper interview, Kennedy and Dutton explained that they had, in their initial article, only been interested in male to female violence. But in so doing, they were reflecting a society that is not interested in violence against men. So I modified my psychological practice to become gender neutral. Still, even today, and I'm sorry to say that many of my colleagues fall into this camp, many psychologists and social workers continue to assume that women are the primary victims while discounting male perspectives. For example, men are disproportionately charged with domestic violence and child abuse, and they face longer sentences when convicted. Men's deaths are sometimes given less consequence than female suffering. As can be seen from this quote from a Rwandan politician. Now, of course, in this quote, she's not recognizing that perhaps the fact that 70% of the population, of the male population, had been decimated in the genocide was, well, you get the picture. This is cross-cultural. Here's a quote from the well-respected Hillary Clinton. Now, okay, there we are. The author here, who wrote a Quillette article in 2019, quotes Clinton as saying, "Women have always been the primary victims of war. Women lose their husbands, their fathers, their sons in combat." This parallels what the politician from Rwanda was saying. The author didn't get it quite right, because Clinton first said this not in 2019, but let's see, I've got it in my notes here. In 1998, at a conference, perhaps somewhat like this one, on domestic violence. So I became curious about the bias behind this. Now, you've heard the word stigmatization before this afternoon in a couple of presentations. And stigmatization has, in that sense, is the stigma that is applied to men who are victims. And there definitely is a stigma. There's also been studies on stigma like the stigma that male nurses face. That's because they're playing a non-traditional role. The stigma I'm interested in, or was interested in, applies to men as a sex, men generally. And the definition I use is pretty much straight from Goffman, who did seminal work on this area in 1963. The imputation of character, which when believed renders members of a targeted group unfit for particular sorts of social interactions. This kind of stigma, as I said, has been studied with regard to male nurses. It's been studied with regard to all kinds of minorities, disabilities. It's been applied to women and studies of women. And I can talk about those, some of those studies if you're interested. But as far as I know, it had never been applied to men as a class before. Okay, this gives a schematic of how I approached the 16 men in my qualitative study. I transcribed and segmented recorded interviews with each segment representing a single idea or concept. I then coded each segment for analysis, and here are the themes that came out. The experience of the men in this study were consistent with the existence of stigma in two related domains. First, men were considered deficient or less responsible as parents. Now, some men have been recognized as being responsible parents, but here's the thing. Facing this stigma, the men who are responsible parents have to prove that they're good parents. It's not assumed that they will be good parents. Second, men were viewed as a potential threat to children and women. An unanticipated result of this was that nearly half of my sample mentioned social work as a source of stigma in their experiences as clients, as students, and in 2 cases as registered social workers themselves. One common experience was that when men attempted to express their negative emotions about how they were abused, and they could have been abused by the justice system, child welfare agencies, employers, often neighbors, because a stigma is widespread. They were told to man up. They were told to be a man. Notice how the stigma is being used to justify another stigma. The message was clear. Men were asked to share their emotions with the suggestion that they were unwell if they don't. And so you heard the term hegemonic masculinity. I'm not going to argue that the term is badly applied, but my experience is, and remember, I've only been an academic a short time in my career. My experience is that when academics apply big words, often they're blaming the victim. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. So there's a suggestion that men are unwell if they don't share their emotions, but they can only share those emotions which are acceptable to the prevailing ideology. This puts men in a double bind. They are blamed for not sharing their emotions, and they are blamed when they do. Stigma is a kind of conspiracy. It's a conspiracy where all the conspirators know the game and reinforce it in each other's mind. And I have 2 minutes. And part of the game is convincing the victims that, hey, this is your fault. I guess, yeah, that's my references for this. I want to conclude by suggesting that the reporting of scientific research can be distorted by confirmation bias. And this is what my talk has been all about. Thus, and this contributes to further stigma. The New Enlightenment Project has seen an accelerated trend in this direction with identity politics, cancel culture, and wokeism affecting the reporting of scientific data. We seek to advance the study of objective reality through science and dispassionate rational thought in these challenging times. We therefore salute all in this conference who are pursuing the aim of dispassionately pursuing the data. Thank you very much.